He didn't even look up from his phone when he posted it. That's what made it worse. Marcus Hale, charming, polished, the kind of man who collected women the way other men collected watches, had uploaded 7 photos from their dinner date before Sienna Cross had even finished her morning coffee. 7 photos. Her laughing. Her reaching for her wine glass. Her looking away from the camera, completely unaware she was being captured. And the caption? Lucky enough to spend the evening with the most beautiful woman I've ever met. Sienna stared at her phone screen, her stomach dropping somewhere below the floor. She hadn't agreed to be photographed. She hadn't agreed to be posted. She hadn't agreed to become content for a man she'd met exactly once, over pasta she barely tasted, while still trying to convince herself that moving on was supposed to feel like something other than grief wearing a dinner jacket. Then her phone lit up. Then it lit up again. Then it wouldn't stop. Because beneath every single photograph, all 7 of them, one account had left one comment. Verified. Blue checkmark. Unmistakable profile photo. Damian Moretti. And all he had written was, mine. One word. 7 times. Like a signature, like a warning, like a man who had never in his entire life needed to say anything twice. The internet didn't just notice. The internet detonated. Bam. If you've ever had someone make a decision about your life without asking you first, if you've ever stood in the middle of a storm you didn't create and had to figure out whether to scream or stand still, then stay with me, because this story is going to ask you something. What would you do if the most dangerous man you'd ever known turned out to be the only one who ever truly saw you? Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will shake you. And when you're done watching, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning had started the way most of Sienna Cross's mornings started, at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm, because her body had long since stopped trusting itself to sleep past dawn. She lay in her apartment on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, staring at the ceiling with the particular kind of wakefulness that wasn't refreshing so much as it was surrender. Her phone was already buzzing on the nightstand. It buzzed the way it always buzzed. Appointments, calendar reminders, forwarded emails from executives who thought the words urgent and I forgot meant the same thing. She reached for it without sitting up. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was opening the notification. Marcus Hale had tagged her in a post. Sienna blinked at the screen. She'd deleted her personal Instagram account 8 months ago, after the breakup with Daniel, after the long, terrible autumn of pretending she was fine at work while falling apart in private. But she still had the app. She'd kept it the way you keep an old coat, not because you wear it, but because throwing it away feels like admitting something. She opened it. The photos loaded one by one. They were actually good photos, which somehow made it worse. Whoever had taken them, she hadn't seen a photographer, hadn't noticed anyone, which meant Marcus had arranged it in advance, had managed to catch her in moments of genuine laughter, which meant moments she hadn't been performing. The restaurant was beautiful. The lighting was warm. She looked happy. She hadn't been happy. She'd been trying to be. There's a difference, and Sienna Cross had spent the last year learning to recognize it. She sat up slowly, read the caption twice, and felt the specific kind of violation that comes not from malice, but from entitlement. Marcus hadn't done this to hurt her. He'd done this because it genuinely hadn't occurred to him that she might not want him to. She was a beautiful woman he'd had dinner with. Sharing that was, to him, simply what you did. She was composing a message to him, carefully worded, firm without being unkind, when the comments started appearing. At first, it was what you'd expect. Fire emojis. Heart emojis. Variations of lucky man and she's stunning from strangers who had no context and no business having opinions. Sienna scrolled past them the way you scroll past noise. Then she stopped scrolling. Her thumb went still. Her lungs did something strange. Damian Moretti commented, "Mine." She checked the account, verified. 4.2 million followers. Profile photo, a professionally taken shot of a man in a charcoal suit looking not at the camera but slightly past it, the way powerful people sometimes do when photographs feel beneath them. Damian Moretti, her boss. The man whose calendar she managed. The man whose coffee she ordered. Black, no sugar, always too hot for any reasonable person, and whose calls she screened and whose meetings she rescheduled and whose dinner reservations she made for women whose names she never remembered because none of them lasted long enough to matter. The man who, in 4 years of working for him, had never once commented on anything about her personal life, had never asked who she was dating, never offered opinions about her choices, never made her feel like she was anything other than exactly what her job title said she was, his executive secretary. She read the comment again. Mine. Then she scrolled to the second photo. Damian Moretti commented, mine. Third photo. Damian Moretti commented, mine. By the time she reached the seventh, a candid shot of her turning toward the window, chin tilted up, looking at something just beyond the frame, her hands were not entirely steady. Damian Moretti commented, mine. Her phone was ringing before she finished reading. Unknown number. Then her work email erupted. Then her personal email. Then the gossip account she didn't follow but existed in her peripheral vision the way traffic noise existed. Always there, never quite foreground. Began screenshotting the thread with captions she couldn't bring herself to read fully. She read enough. The Moretti boss's secretary? He literally just claimed her in public. What is happening? This is either the most romantic thing I've ever seen or a hostage situation. Sienna set her phone face down on the bed. She sat there for exactly 4 minutes. Then she got up, got dressed, and went to work. There was a particular walk that Sienna had developed over 4 years at Moretti Group, a walk that said, I am not available for this conversation without requiring her to actually say it. Shoulders back, pace measured, eyes forward, expression precisely neutral. Not cold, not warm, calibrated. The kind of expression that made people step slightly aside in hallways without entirely understanding why. She used it now as she moved through the lobby of the Moretti Group headquarters, through the marble atrium where the security team tried very hard not to look at her, past the receptionist who was biting her lip in a way that meant she'd definitely seen the posts, into the private elevator that went directly to the 38th floor. Her phone had not stopped since she'd left her apartment. She'd texted Marcus one message. Please remove those photos. I didn't consent to being posted. He'd responded with 3 separate apology messages and an of course, and then spent the next 40 minutes not removing them, which told her everything she needed to know about Marcus Hale's relationship with the word sorry. The elevator doors opened. Damian's personal assistant, a young man named Troy, who had lasted 11 months in the role, a record by Moretti standards, looked up from his desk with the expression of a man watching a natural disaster approach from a distance he'd calculated was not far enough. He's expecting you, Troy said. He's always expecting me, Sienna said. I run his schedule. Right, yes. I just mean... Troy stopped. He said specifically that you'd be coming in, before your normal time. Sienna paused for exactly 1 second. Then she walked to the office door, knocked twice, because she always knocked twice, regardless of whose office it was, regardless of how furious she was, and pushed it open without waiting for a response. The thing about Damian Moretti's office was that it told you something about him if you knew how to look. Most people walked in and saw the obvious things: the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, the mahogany desk that cost more than some apartments, the clean lines and deliberate absence of clutter. They saw a man who had built something enormous and wanted you to feel the size of it. Sienna had stopped seeing any of that approximately 18 months into her employment. What she saw now was Damian himself, standing at the window with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, jacket on at this hour, which meant he'd been here since before she arrived. He was looking at the city the way he always looked at things he was responsible for. Not admiringly, but assessingly, like he was checking it for damage. He didn't turn around when she came in. Close the door, he said. She closed the door. Sit down. I'd rather stand. A pause. Small, but there. All right, he said. He turned then, and she looked at his face the way she always did when she needed to read a situation. The jaw, the eyes, the particular tension around his mouth that most people never learned to interpret. He looked the same as he always did, composed, unreachable, like a man who had long since made peace with being misunderstood. I want an explanation, she said. Not a justification. An explanation. They're not the same thing to you. No. A justification is why you think it was okay. An explanation is why you actually did it. She held his gaze. Start with the explanation. Damien was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man avoiding a question. The quiet of a man deciding how much to say. Marcus Hale, he said, is a financial consultant. Technically, his firm, Meridian Capital, processes investments for approximately 14 different shell companies across 3 countries. 7 of those shells are controlled by a man named Victor Drell. He paused. You don't know that name? No. You shouldn't. People who know that name tend to end up in positions they didn't anticipate. His voice was even. Completely even. Victor Drell has been attempting to locate a leverage point against me for approximately 6 months. He's been unsuccessful because anyone I care about is already protected. Anyone except... He stopped. Sienna felt something shift in the room. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies with a change in lighting or a swelling soundtrack, just a subtle cellular rearrangement of the air between them. Except me, she said. You hadn't been visible, Damien said. You've worked for me for 4 years and you've never appeared in a photograph, never attended a social event in any capacity other than professional, never given anyone a reason to look at you and connect you to me as anything more than an employee. He moved from the window finally and sat at the edge of his desk, not behind it, which she noticed, because sitting behind his desk was what he did when he wanted the desk between them. When Hale posted those photographs and tagged your name, you became visible. The moment you became visible as the woman a man was publicly courting, Drell's people would have run your name, they would have found your employment, they would have made a calculation. Sienna's jaw was tight. So you made a bigger one. I made a faster one. By writing mine on a public post. By making it immediately, globally clear that any threat directed at you would land on me. He didn't blink. Drell's people don't want a confrontation with me. They want leverage. You can't use someone as leverage against a man who has already publicly claimed them. The equation changes. It becomes a direct attack, and direct attacks have direct consequences. Consequences they're not ready for. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Sienna had been in enough difficult conversations to know the difference between a silence that was an ending and a silence that was a held breath. This was the second kind. You decided, she said, that the correct way to protect me was to publicly claim ownership of me. Without asking. There wasn't time to ask. There's always time to ask. There wasn't. His voice didn't harden. It just became more precise, which was in some ways worse. By the time I saw the post, Drell's people had already been active for 40 minutes. I had 40 seconds, maybe less, before they ran your name and made a connection. I made a decision. You made a decision about my life. I made a decision that kept you alive to argue with me about it. She looked at him for a long moment. Damien Moretti had always been difficult to read, not because he hid things. She'd come to understand that he was, in fact, remarkably honest, in the particular way that very dangerous people sometimes are, because they've learned they don't need to lie, but because the things he felt and the way he expressed them were separated by what seemed like an enormous, carefully maintained distance. That distance looked smaller right now. You're telling me, she said slowly, that my date last night was unknowingly connected to one of your enemies. Correct. And that this enemy was looking for a way to use someone close to me against you. Close to me, he said. Not you, me. Yes. And your solution was to make an internationally visible declaration on a public platform that I... She stopped, breathed, that I belong to you, that you are protected by me. That is not what you wrote. For the first time, something moved across his face. It was brief, gone almost before she could name it, but it was there. Something that was not quite guilt, and not quite admission, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. No, he said. It isn't. The honesty of it knocked her slightly sideways. She'd come in here prepared for deflection, for the cool executive rationality that he deployed like a climate system, precise and impersonal. She hadn't prepared for him to agree with her. I didn't only post it for operational reasons, he said. His voice was still even. That was the thing about Damien. Even when he was saying something that cost him something, the voice stayed level, as though the feeling and the expression of the feeling had reached a long-standing detente. I posted it because I saw a man photographing you without your knowledge in a restaurant I know he booked specifically to be seen in, and a pause. I didn't like it. You didn't like it, she repeated. No, that's not a sufficient I know. Another silence. Sienna? He said her name rarely. In 4 years, she could count on both hands the number of times he'd used her first name. Each time it had stopped her slightly. She didn't know if he knew that. She suspected he did. I have watched you work in this office for 4 years. I have watched you manage impossible situations with a kind of competence that most people in this building don't deserve. I've watched you stay late when you didn't have to, push back on decisions I was wrong about, walk into rooms full of men who thought less of you and leave them with fewer certainties than they'd arrived with. He was still at the edge of his desk, not moving toward her. That felt deliberate. I have been... He stopped, started again. I am not a man who says things like this easily. I'm aware, she said. I care about what happens to you, not as my employee, not because of what losing you would mean to my operation, because... He exhaled, very slightly. Because you are the most real person in my life, and I have apparently spent an embarrassing amount of time knowing that without saying it, and when I saw those photographs last night, I realized that someone else was looking at you the same way I have been looking at you. And unlike me, he was going to act on it, and You acted on it by posting a one-word possessive comment on the internet, she said. Yes. A beat. That was not my finest moment. She wanted to stay angry. She was good at staying angry. She'd practiced it across a long relationship with a man who'd taught her that anger was the only emotion that kept you from disappearing, and she'd gotten very skilled at maintaining it, even when it cost her. But something in the way he'd said the most real person in my life sat in her chest like a weight she hadn't been asked to carry and wasn't sure she could put down. She walked to the window. Not to him. To the window. To the city outside it, sprawling and indifferent, 40 stories down. I'm not yours, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. I know, he said. Saying it publicly doesn't make it true. I know that too. And whatever your operational reasoning was, she pressed her fingers briefly against the glass. You don't get to make that call about my life without talking to me first, regardless of the timeline, regardless of the threat. You're right, he said. She turned to look at him. He was watching her, not the way most men watched her. Not appraisingly, not possessively, not with the particular male calculation that she'd learned to identify and deflect. He was watching her the way someone watches a thing they know they might lose, with the specific, painful attention of a person who has realized too late that they've been taking something for granted. I'm right, she said. And you still did it. Yes. And you do it again. The answer took a moment. I would do it differently, he said carefully. If I had time. I don't want to override your choices. I never wanted that. I wanted you to be safe. There's a version of that that doesn't involve claiming me in front of 4 million strangers. There is, he agreed, and I would find it, given time. Last night, I had no time. Sienna stood at the window for a long moment. Outside, Manhattan moved through its morning the way it always did, relentlessly, without concern for the people inside its buildings who were in the process of having their lives quietly rearranged. She had come into this office furious. She was still something, not calm, not resolved, not anywhere near the comfortable anger she'd walked in with. But it had changed shape while she wasn't paying attention, and she wasn't entirely sure what it had become. I need to think, she said. All right. I need you to understand that that this isn't over as a conversation. I understand. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it down when she came in, walked to the door, put her hand on the handle. Damien. Yes. She didn't turn around. Did you actually think one word on the internet was going to stop a man like the one you're describing? A long pause. No, he said, But it stopped him from thinking you were easy to reach, and it put every one of his people on notice that you were watched. Another pause. And it told you, even if this isn't the way I would have chosen to tell you, that there is someone in your life who would burn the world before he let it touch you. Sienna stood at the door, her hand on the handle, her heart doing something she hadn't authorized it to do. She walked out. And in the elevator going down, she made herself breathe slowly, made herself think practically, made herself focus on the 7 photographs still public on a platform with a combined audience in the millions, made herself focus on everything except the fact that for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, someone had looked at her not as something to display or something to use or something to eventually disappoint, but as something worth protecting. She told herself it didn't matter. She was good at telling herself things. She was getting less good at believing them. The elevator doors closed and Sienna watched her own reflection in the polished steel. A woman with a straight spine and a face that had learned through considerable practice not to show what was happening underneath it. She looked composed. She was not composed. The lobby received her the same way it always did. Security guards who nodded without making eye contact, the marble floor that echoed every step, the glass revolving door that exhaled her onto the sidewalk and into a Tuesday morning that smelled like exhaust and coffee and the particular indifference of a city that had no interest in anyone's personal crisis. Her phone had 247 notifications. She put it in her bag and walked to the coffee cart on the corner, the one run by a man named Eddie, who'd been there for 9 years and had never once asked her anything about her job, her life, or her feelings, which made him one of her favorite people in Manhattan. "The usual?" Eddie said. "Please." He handed her a medium dark roast with a lid that didn't quite seal properly, so you had to hold it at an angle. She'd never told him about the lid. She'd been holding the cup at an angle for 3 years. "You okay?" he said. Not because he wanted to know. Eddie always asked because he'd decided it was the polite thing to do, the same way he'd decided to put a small plastic bear of honey next to the sugar packets, even though she'd never used it. "Fine," she said. "Rough morning?" "Average," she said, which was technically accurate in the sense that it was not the worst morning she'd ever had and not the best, and left the rest unsaid, the way you do when the truth is too complicated for a coffee transaction. She paid, she walked, she had 40 minutes before her first meeting of the day, a budget review for a subsidiary acquisition that had been in progress since February, and showed no signs of resolving itself with any efficiency. And she used those 40 minutes the way she used most difficult stretches of time, by working. She answered 7 emails. She rescheduled a call that had been rescheduled twice already. She drafted a response to a legal inquiry that had been sitting in her inbox since Friday and required the specific kind of careful language that meant you were declining something without appearing to decline it. She did not think about the word mine. She thought about it continuously. By 10:30, the office had achieved the particular atmosphere of a place where everyone knows something and is pretending not to. Sienna had worked in enough environments to recognize it. The way conversations stopped a half-second too late when she walked by. The way Troy brought her a copy of her afternoon schedule without being asked, and then found a reason to be somewhere else very quickly. The way 2 of the junior analysts on the floor below sent her meeting requests for things that could have been emails. People wanted to ask. No one was going to ask. That was fine. That was exactly how Sienna wanted it. What was not fine was the email she found waiting in her inbox at 11:04 a.m. from an address she didn't recognize, through a server that her security software flagged as masked. The subject line read, "You should be more careful about who you work for." She stared at it for 12 seconds. Then she forwarded it to Damien's private encrypted line, typed 1 sentence. This came in 11 minutes ago. And went back to the budget review. The response from Damien's line came in 4 minutes. "Don't open anything else from that address. Don't reply. I'll handle it." "Are you still in the building?" She typed back, "Yes." His response, "Stay there until I tell you otherwise." She looked at that for a moment. Then she typed, "I don't take orders from you outside of work responsibilities." A pause. Then, "I'm asking, not ordering." She set the phone face down. She went back to the budget review. She got through approximately 6 minutes of it before her desk line rang, the internal line, the one with only 11 people's numbers programmed into it. And she answered it because the display said it was from the 38th floor, which was Damien's floor, but the extension wasn't his office. It was the conference room. Sienna. The voice on the other end was not Damien. It was a man named Carver, who handled Damien's security operations, and who Sienna had spoken to perhaps 4 times in 4 years, always briefly, always in the context of logistics. He had the voice of a man who'd spent a long time in rooms where voices were kept low out of practical necessity. Can you come up to 38? Not your boss's office, the East Conference Room. What's this about? It's better in person. Mr. Carver, I have a meeting at noon that I need to prepare for, so if you could… Sienna. A pause. Please. Carver did not say please. In 4 years, she was certain she'd never heard him use the word. She closed her laptop. She went upstairs. The East Conference Room had 4 people in it when she arrived, none of whom she had expected. Carver sat at the head of the table with the particular stillness of a man built for waiting. To his right was a woman Sienna had never seen before. Late 40s, dark hair going gray at the temples, wearing a jacket that looked like it had been slept in, which somehow made her look more authoritative rather than less. Across from her sat one of Damien's senior advisors, a man named Reston, who normally projected the energy of someone who had never once in his professional life felt uncertain about anything. Reston looked uncertain. And at the window, back to the room the same way he'd been standing that morning, was Damien. Sienna walked in and took a seat without being invited to, because she'd learned early in this job that sitting down before being asked to established a particular kind of conversational parity that she found useful. Who is she? Sienna asked, looking at the woman in the slept-in jacket. My name is Aldridge, the woman said. I'm a forensic analyst, independent contractor. She slid a folder across the table. I work for Mr. Moretti on specific assignments. Sienna didn't open the folder. What kind of assignments? The kind where someone needs to know the full picture before they know they're in it. Aldridge tapped the folder once with 2 fingers. You should look at this. Sienna opened it. The first page was a corporate org chart. Meridian Capital at the top, with branching lines going down through a structure that grew more complex the further down it went. Holding companies and subsidiary entities and investment vehicles with names like they'd been chosen specifically to sound unremarkable. The 7th company down on the left branch was circled in red. Below the circle, in handwriting rather than print, someone had written Victor Drell, confirmed controller. Also see person. See personnel connections. She turned to the second page. It was a photograph. Marcus Hale, shaking hands with a man in a gray suit outside what appeared to be a hotel entrance. The man in the gray suit was identified in a caption at the bottom. Drell Associate, Asset Recruitment, East Coast. Sienna looked at the photograph for a long moment. When was this taken? She said. 3 weeks ago, Aldridge said. 3 weeks. She'd met Marcus 4 days ago, introduced through a mutual friend, a woman named Petra, who worked in finance, and who had seemed completely genuine in her enthusiasm for setting Sienna up with someone she described as stable and kind and nothing like your last one, which had been the selling point, honestly, because Sienna's last one had been neither. Petra, she said, and it wasn't a question so much as a thought that arrived out loud. Carver answered it anyway. We're looking into Ms. Petra Voss. We don't believe she knew, but we can't confirm that yet. The air in the room had a particular quality. The quality of information landing in stages, each one shifting the floor slightly before the next one came. Sienna had experienced it before, in smaller ways, in difficult meetings where the full scope of a problem revealed itself incrementally. This was that same feeling, but larger. More personal. She turned to look at Damien. He had turned from his window at some point while she was looking at the folder, and he was watching her now with the expression she'd learned to associate with him at his most controlled, which meant, she'd come to understand, at his most concerned. The control was not coldness. It was containment. A man holding something at a very specific distance because he knew what happened when it got closer. You knew about Hale before the dinner, she said. The room went very still. Not about Hale specifically, Damien said. I knew Drell was moving. I knew he was looking for an angle. I didn't know he'd found you. A pause. I should have. That's on me. It's on you, she repeated. Yes. It's on you, she said again, and her voice had dropped in a way that wasn't volume so much as temperature. That a man I went to dinner with was placed in my life by people connected to your enemies, and you didn't tell me that your enemies were looking for ways to reach me, and I went... She stopped. Reset. I went on a date in a restaurant that was probably watched, and I had no idea, and you had information that might have... I didn't have enough information to... You had more than I did. The silence that followed was of the kind that's generated not by lack of things to say, but by the weight of the things being said. Reston cleared his throat. Nobody looked at him. You should have told me, Sienna said. Whatever you knew, whatever you suspected, you should have told me. You work with me. I sit 40 feet below your office, and we interact every single day, and you... She pressed her fingers flat on the table in front of her. You decided I didn't need to know. I decided you were safer not knowing. That is the same decision every person who has ever failed to protect someone has made, she said. That is the thing people say before something goes wrong. Damien was quiet. She'd had arguments with him before, professional arguments, pointed and sometimes fierce, about decisions she disagreed with and choices she found questionable, and the particular brand of unilateral authority he sometimes deployed in ways that made her teeth hurt. She'd always found the arguments clarifying. She'd come out of them knowing more about both the situation and the man than she'd known going in. This one felt different. This one felt like something tearing. Sienna, Carver said. His voice was careful. There's more. She looked at him. He nodded at the folder. She turned to the third page. It was a printout of a digital surveillance log. Dates and times in the left column, locations in the right, and in the middle column, a brief notation for each entry. She scanned the first few lines, and the sensation was something like stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. A lurch, a catch, a sudden wrong footing. The dates went back 6 weeks. The locations included her gym, the dry cleaner she used, the subway station she sometimes used when it was raining, the diner 3 blocks from her apartment where she had breakfast on Sundays. Someone had been watching her for 6 weeks. Not Damien's people. The notations were in Aldridge's shorthand, and the summary at the bottom of the page was clear. Third-party surveillance, not our assets. Believe Drell-connected, purpose assessment. They've been watching me, she said. For at least 6 weeks, Aldridge confirmed. Possibly longer. This is just what we've been able to verify. And your people, Sienna said, still looking at the page, knew about this for how long? A pause. 48 hours, Carver said. She did the math without meaning to. 48 hours ago was Sunday. Marcus Hale had asked her to dinner on Saturday. He had sent her the restaurant information Sunday afternoon, which she had accepted Sunday evening, which was, 48 hours ago, was the precise window in which Damien's team had known she was being watched, and had said nothing to her about it. She closed the folder. I'd like to speak to Damien alone, she said. Reston was out the door in under 5 seconds, which told her he'd been waiting for that sentence since she walked in. Aldridge gathered her materials with the efficiency that suggested she'd been through rooms like this before and knew when the real conversation was about to start. Carver paused at the door, looked at Damien. Some brief communication passed between them that Sienna wasn't meant to read, though she read enough of it, and then left, pulling the door shut behind him. The room was suddenly very quiet. 48 hours, Sienna said. Yes. You knew Sunday. My people confirmed it Sunday, and the decision was made not to tell me. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him decide between versions of the truth and settle on the most complete one, which was something she'd observed him do before, the way he treated honesty as a calculation rather than a reflex, which was honest in itself in its way. I wanted to verify the full scope before alarming you, he said. Incomplete information causes people to make choices that don't, she said. He stopped. Don't finish that sentence with a reason, she said. I've heard that sentence finished with reasons before, by someone who also thought protecting me from information was the same thing as protecting me. It isn't. It never is. It just means I don't get to make my own decisions because someone else decided I couldn't handle what I needed to know in order to make them. Something moved across his face. She didn't have a word for it. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was more like recognition. Like a man who'd arrived at a place he'd been to before, from a different direction, and realized it was the same place. You're right, he said. Stop agreeing with me and then doing the same thing anyway. Sienna, no. Her voice wasn't raised. She'd learned that raised voices spent too much of themselves on volume. This was quieter and harder. I have given you 4 years of work that was better than you had any right to expect from someone in this role. I have covered for you and managed you and pushed back on you when you were wrong and kept my mouth shut when I should have pushed harder. I have done all of that without asking you for anything except to treat me like someone whose judgment you respect. She held his gaze. And you sat in your office on Sunday knowing that strangers were tracking my movements through my own neighborhood, and you decided that I would be better served by not knowing. The silence that followed was the longest one so far. I was wrong, he said. Simple. No caveat. No follow-up clause. Just the 3 words said like a man who'd had practice at being wrong but no real practice at saying it. She looked at him. She thought about the morning in the elevator, about the city indifferent outside the building, about the photograph of Marcus Hale shaking hands with a man she'd never seen, 3 weeks before he asked her to dinner, about Petra, who had seemed so genuinely pleased to make the introduction, about her own apartment, the 14th floor, the coffee she'd been making alone for 8 months, the Sunday diner breakfast she'd thought were hers. Is my apartment secure? She asked. We're sweeping it today. Without my permission. A beat. I was going to call you. When? After this meeting. She stood. She moved to the window where he'd been standing earlier. Not to stand beside him, but to stand somewhere other than the chair, because sitting felt suddenly too still for what was moving through her. Manhattan was still out there. Still indifferent. A garbage truck was making a pickup 3 blocks over, and the sound of it reached up through the glass, muted and ordinary. The sound of a city doing its business regardless. I need you to hear something, she said to the window. I'm listening. I am not angry because you tried to protect me. She paused. I am angry because in protecting me, you treated me the same way every person who has ever underestimated me has treated me. Like information was too heavy for me to carry. Like I would break if I knew the full weight of my own situation. She turned. I don't break. I have never broken. And the people in my life who assumed I would are the same people who are no longer in it. He held her gaze. I understand, he said. I need you to mean that. I do. Because if another 48-hour window happens, she picked up her bag. I won't be walking out of your conference room. I'll be walking out of this building. She went to the door. Sienna. His voice stopped her the same way it always did. Not with volume, not with force, but with a particular quality of attention, like a room going quiet. The threat isn't abstract. Whatever Drell is planning, it's not surveillance anymore. The email this morning, a pause. My people intercepted 2 more like it this morning. Different routes, they're escalating. She stood at the door, her back to him. What does escalating mean? She asked. It means we're past the information gathering stage. His voice was even. They're past trying to figure out how to use you. They've made a decision about what to do instead. She turned slightly, not all the way, just enough to see him in her peripheral vision. And what is it they've decided to do? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, the words were quiet and direct and carried no flourish at all because they didn't need any. Drell doesn't negotiate, he said. When he can't use something, he removes it. The room was very still. Sienna Cross stood at the door of a conference room on the 38th floor of a building in Manhattan, and she felt the world reorganize itself around her. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies, but in the small, terrible way that real things reorganize themselves, which is quietly, without warning, like a door locking behind you in a room you didn't know you'd entered. She had 40 minutes before her noon meeting. She had apparently become a target, and the man standing behind her, the man who had written one word on the internet and detonated a situation she still didn't fully understand, was the only person in her life who knew the full shape of what was coming. She did not want to need him. She had spent a long time not needing anyone, and she'd gotten very good at it, and it had kept her intact through things that should have broken her, and she was not ready to give that up for a man who made unilateral decisions about her safety while simultaneously being the only person capable of ensuring it. But Drell's people knew where her dry cleaner was. They knew which subway station she used when it rained. They knew her Sunday diner. She turned fully and looked at Damian Moretti. Really looked at him, the way she hadn't let herself since she'd walked into his office that morning, the way she avoided because she knew from long experience that there were things you could see in a person's face if you looked too long and too honestly. And once you saw them, you couldn't go back to. She looked at him the way she hadn't let herself look since morning. And what she saw stopped the breath in her chest for exactly 1 second. Not the billionaire, not the executive, not the man who moved through the world as though it had been arranged for his convenience. She saw someone who was afraid, not the theatrical fear of a man performing vulnerability. The real thing. The quiet, contained terror of a person who has identified something they cannot afford to lose and is only now understanding how close to losing it they actually are. It lived in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands and the way he was watching her like she might disappear between one word and the next. She had not expected that. She didn't know what to do with it. So she did the thing she always did when she didn't know what to do with something. She filed it somewhere internal and promised herself she'd deal with it when she had time. And she walked out of the conference room and she went back downstairs to prepare for her noon meeting. And she did not let herself think about the shape of fear on a face she'd spent 4 years reading. Well, the noon meeting ran 40 minutes over because it always did. Sienna sat at the foot of the table and took notes and asked 2 questions that shortened the third quarter argument by approximately 20 minutes. And when it was done, she walked back to her desk and found a paper coffee cup sitting on it. Not from the building's kitchen, which used styrofoam. From Eddie's cart on the corner, with a lid that didn't quite seal, which meant someone had gone down to the street specifically to get it for her. There was no note. She didn't need one. She drank the coffee at the right angle and answered emails and did not look at her phone's personal notifications for 47 minutes, which was the longest she'd managed all day. When she finally looked, there were 19 missed calls, 3 from numbers she didn't recognize, 4 from Petra, the rest from journalists, which she identified by the area codes and the time gaps between attempts, the rhythmic persistence of people who got paid to wear you down. She called Petra back first, because Petra had called 4 times in 2 hours, and because whatever Petra had or hadn't done, she'd been Sienna's friend for 6 years, and the alternative was assuming the worst about someone she loved, which she was not ready to do yet without evidence she'd held in her own hands. Petra answered on the first ring. Sienna. Oh, thank God. I've been... Her voice was the voice of someone who'd been crying recently and had mostly stopped. I've seen everything online, and I need you to know that I had no idea. I swear to you, Marcus reached out to me through a work contact, and I thought he seemed so normal, Sienna. I would never... Petra. She kept her voice level. Take a breath. A sound on the other end, shaky inhale. I need you to tell me exactly how you met him, Sienna said. The work contact. Who was it? How did they introduce him? When did it happen? Petra told her. It took 6 minutes and involved a networking event in February, a mutual connection at an investment conference, a LinkedIn message that Petra had screenshotted and sent to Sienna's phone by the end of the call. Sienna looked at the screenshot and felt the specific grinding nausea of a pattern making itself clear. Marcus Hale, appearing in Petra's professional orbit at the exact moment Drell's people would have been mapping Sienna's personal connections. It was not Petra's fault. It was also not an accident. Don't talk to anyone about this, Sienna said. Not press, not colleagues, not anyone you don't completely trust. If anyone approaches you about me or about Marcus, you call me directly. Are you okay? Petra's voice had the particular urgency of someone who's asking the question they actually want answered, not the polite version. Sienna, are you actually okay? Sienna looked at her desk, at the coffee cup from the corner cart, at the window beyond her monitor, where the afternoon was going gray at the edges. I'm working on it, she said, which was the most honest answer she had. At 3:15, Carver appeared at her desk. He didn't sit. Carver never sat in her area, which she'd always taken as professional courtesy, her space, her territory. But today it struck her differently. Today it struck her as a man who wanted to be able to move quickly. We finished the sweep, he said. She looked up from her screen. Your apartment, he clarified. Clean. No devices, no intrusion evidence beyond... He paused. Not hesitation. Precision. Choosing the right word. Beyond what we can verify externally. What does beyond what you can verify externally mean? It means your locks show no sign of forced entry, but the security feed for your floor has a 4-minute gap from 3 nights ago. Wednesday between 2 and 2:04 a.m. She thought about Wednesday night. She'd been asleep by midnight. She slept lightly, always had, worse since the breakup, and she was reasonably certain she'd have woken if someone had been moving through her apartment. Reasonably certain. What are you telling me? She said. I'm telling you what we found, Carver said carefully. I'm not in a position to tell you what it means yet. Best guess, Bus. He considered that for a moment. Someone walked through your home, he said, learned the layout, didn't take anything, didn't leave anything we can find. He let that settle. That's the kind of thing people do when they're planning a next step and they want to know the terrain. She sat with that for a long 3 seconds. Mr. Moretti wants you in the building tonight, Carver said. There's a secured residence on 41. It's been used before for... No, she said. Sienna. No. She turned back to her screen. I'm not hiding in my own workplace. If I do that, whoever is doing this wins something. I won't give them that. Carver was quiet for a moment. She heard him decide not to argue, which told her he'd been told not to argue with her, which meant Damien had anticipated this response, which gave her a feeling she couldn't entirely name, part irritation, part something warmer that she refused to examine. Then we'll have someone on your building tonight, Carver said. Discreet. Always. He left. She went back to work. At 5:47, she shut down her computer, gathered her things, and rode the elevator down alone. In the lobby, she paused, just for a moment, without showing that she was pausing. A small adjustment of her bag, a glance at her phone, and scanned the atrium the way Carver had taught her without meaning to, through years of watching him move through spaces, checking sightlines and exits the way most people check the time. 3 people in the lobby she didn't recognize. 2 of them were on phones. 1 was reading something. All 3 of them didn't look at her. That was the thing she'd learned, somewhere along the way. The people you should worry about are the ones who don't look at you. She walked out into the evening. Bullshit. The car appeared on the second block. Dark, medium-sized, unremarkable, in the way that things chosen to be unremarkable always slightly aren't. It stayed 2 car lengths back through the first turn and matched her pace when she slowed slightly at a crosswalk, an involuntary test, the kind she didn't consciously plan but found herself running anyway. It matched. She kept walking, kept her breathing measured, took out her phone with the practiced casualness of someone checking messages, and typed to Carver's number, car following, gray sedan, 2 behind me on 51st. The response came in under a minute. We see it. Keep walking. Don't change pace. She kept walking. At the next intersection, she turned north instead of west, a deviation from her usual route, deliberate, without hesitation in her stride. The sedan took the turn 20 seconds later. Her phone buzzed. Our team is parallel on the next block. You're covered. Keep going straight. She kept going straight. The thing about being followed, she was learning in real time, was that it was not like in movies. It didn't feel cinematic or charged. It felt like being slightly too aware of everything. The sound of footsteps behind her, the weight of her bag, the way the streetlights were just starting to come on against the gray sky. It felt like the way you feel when you know someone is watching you, but you haven't turned around yet to confirm it. It felt More than anything, like the world had gotten slightly smaller. She made it to her building without incident. The lobby, the elevator, 14th floor, her door, locks intact, apartment quiet. She stood inside the door for a moment with her back against it in the dark and breathed. Then she turned on the lights and made dinner and called her sister in Chicago, who didn't know any of this was happening and would not be told, because her sister had 2 kids and a mortgage and enough of her own weight to carry, and sometimes the best thing you can do for the people you love is not add yours to the pile. She went to bed at 11. She did not sleep well. At 2:14 a.m., her phone lit up with a call from Carver's number. She was awake before it completed the first ring. "Get dressed," Carver said. "Now, don't turn on any lights you haven't already got on. Leave through your building's service exit, ground level, east side. There will be a black car there." "What's happening?" "The sedan from earlier is back, different driver, and there's a second vehicle we just picked up parked at the north end of your block." A pause, the kind that carries weight. "Miss Cross, please move now." She was already moving. She pulled on clothes in the dark, jeans, a sweater, the boots she'd left by the door out of habit, grabbed her bag, her phone, her keys, left her apartment in under 90 seconds. The service stairs were at the end of the hall, and she took them at a pace that wasn't quite running, because running in a stairwell at 2 a.m. made noise, and she had no idea what was in the stairwell ahead of her. The service exit opened onto a narrow side passage between buildings. The black car was there, engine running. She got in. Carver was in the front passenger seat. The driver was someone she'd seen twice before. One of Damien's security team, a quiet man named Ferris, who had the hands of someone who worked with them for purposes other than typing. He pulled out before she'd finished closing the door. "What happened?" she said. "Your building's night shift security was approached at shift change," Carver said, not turning around, watching the wing mirror. "Someone offered him a substantial amount of money for your floor plan and your unit number. He refused, reported it to his supervisor, and the supervisor called the emergency contact on your resident file." "Which is the Moretti Group main line." "Which routes to me after hours, yes." She let that settle. "And the vehicles?" "Gone by the time our people moved on them, plated clean, rentals under business names that were running now." She watched the city move past the window. At 2 a.m., Manhattan had a different quality. Emptier, but not empty. Lit, but not bright. The particular midnight version of itself that existed between the late crowd going home and the early crowd heading out. She'd never felt unsafe in it before. She felt the absence of that now. "Where are we going?" she asked. Carver glanced at Ferris. A small thing. She caught it. "Where are we going?" she said again. Harder. Mr. Moretti asked, "Where?" "His family's property," Carver said. "Outside the city. It's secured. It's—" "Carver." She leaned forward. "I told you I wasn't going to hide." "You told me you weren't hiding in the building," Carver said, and there was something in his voice that was not unkind, but was very firm. "There are 2 teams that just disappeared from outside your home, and a man who was offered money to give strangers your apartment layout. That's past surveillance, Ms. Cross. That's reconnaissance." He met her eyes in the mirror. "Mr. Moretti is already there." She sat back. She looked out the window at the city going past. She thought about the 4-minute gap in her floor's security feed. Wednesday, 2 to 2, 04 a.m. Someone learning the terrain. "How long?" she said. "Couple hours? Maybe less." She didn't argue again. She slept in the car, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to, hadn't meant to, and woke as they were leaving the highway, the road narrowing and the city lights giving way to the kind of darkness that meant actual countryside. Her neck ached from the angle. She straightened slowly and looked out at the dark and the tree line and the pale indication of a structure ahead. The Moretti property was not what she'd expected, which was foolish in retrospect. She'd constructed some image in her mind of a fortified compound, walls and gates, and the aesthetic vocabulary of security made visible. What they drove through instead was a gate set into a low stone wall, barely marked, and then a long drive through what smelled like vineyard, and then a house that was large but not aggressive about it, the kind of house that had been built by someone who didn't feel the need to announce themselves. There were lights on inside. A woman opened the front door before they reached it. She was in her 60s, with Damien's jaw and none of his containment. Her face was the kind that showed everything, had probably always shown everything, and had long since made peace with that. She was wearing a cardigan over what appeared to be pajamas, and she had the expression of a woman who had been awake waiting and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You must be Sienna," she said. Not a question. She had an accent, Italian but worn down by years, the consonants softened. She took Sienna's hands between both of hers without asking. "I'm Elena, Damien's mother. Come inside. You're cold." Sienna was cold. She hadn't noticed until someone said it. The inside of the house was warm in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with use. A home that had been lived in fully, where the furniture had been chosen for comfort rather than appearance. And the kitchen, which they walked through, smelled of something that had been on the stove recently. A low lamp was on over the table, 2 chairs at it with cups. Damien was standing at the far end of the kitchen. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who had not slept. He was still dressed, dark shirt, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and he was looking at her with the expression she'd seen in the conference room, the one she'd filed away to deal with later. It was still there. She'd run out of later. "You're all right," he said. Also not a question. "I'm annoyed," she said. "Which is close enough." Something shifted in his expression. The very edge of something that might, under different circumstances, have been relief. His mother looked between them with the absolute comprehension of a woman who had raised at least one person who expressed everything sideways and had learned to translate. She said something in Italian, quietly, directed at Damien. And Damien responded in the same language, 2 words, and his mother made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, and was not quite exasperation, and was somehow both. And then she pressed Sienna's hands once more and said she'd put towels in the second room at the top of the stairs, and to eat something first, there was bread, and then she was gone. The kitchen was quiet. Sienna sat down at the table because she was tired in a way that her legs had decided to make structural rather than optional. She pulled the nearer cup toward her, tea, still warm, and wrapped her hands around it. Damien sat across from her. Not immediately. He stood for a moment longer, watching her, and she let him, because she understood now that the watching wasn't possession. It was the kind of checking over that a person does when they've been afraid, and the thing they were afraid of losing is now in front of them. "Your mother is not what I expected," she said. "She rarely is. She called me by name. I've mentioned you." Sienna looked at the cup. "How much have you mentioned me?" A pause. "Enough that she knew your name," he said carefully, "and approximately how I feel about you." She let that sit there without picking it up. "Tell me about Victor Drell," she said. "Everything. Not the operational summary, not what Aldridge put in the folder. What I need to understand." He told her. It took 40 minutes and 3 refills of the cup and covered ground that she suspected very few people outside of Damien's innermost circle had ever been given access to. The history of the conflict, the nature of Drell's operation, the specific sequence of events that had escalated a business rivalry into something that had been, for the last 18 months, increasingly personal. He was direct and precise, and completely without the protective editing she'd expected, and by the end of it she understood 2 things clearly. The first was that this was significantly more dangerous than she'd allowed herself to fully register. The second was that Damien had been carrying this alone for a very long time, and the effort of it was visible now in a way she hadn't been positioned to see from across a professional boundary. "Why didn't you expand your protection to me sooner?" she asked. "If you knew I was adjacent to your exposure." He was quiet for a moment. "Because expanding protection to you," he said, "would have meant acknowledging formally, to my people and to Drell's intelligence, that you were someone I cared about beyond your professional capacity." He looked at the table. "I thought keeping you invisible was keeping you safe. I thought if no one knew what you were to me, no one would use it." "What I was to you," she said. "Am," he said quietly. She looked at him. She was very tired. The kind of tired that was partly sleep and partly the accumulated weight of a day that had started with a verified Instagram comment and ended with a 2-hour drive in the dark to a vineyard she hadn't known existed. Her defenses were lower than she'd have chosen, and she was aware of that, and she was also too tired to do much about it. "I don't know what to do with you," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him since morning. "I know," he said. "You make decisions about my life without asking me. You know things you don't tell me. She stopped. "And at the same time, you are apparently the only reason I am sitting in a warm kitchen instead of—" She didn't finish that sentence. "I know," he said again. "That's not a resolution." "No, it isn't." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in him properly. The shadows under his eyes, the slight roughness of his jaw, the particular worn quality of someone who had been operating at maximum containment for too long. "I'm not asking you to resolve it tonight." "What are you asking?" "Right now?" He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to stay here, where I know you're safe, until I have a clearer picture of what Drell is planning, that's all." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood, picked up the cup, took it to the sink, rinsed it. The domesticity of the gesture felt strange and also somehow not strange at all, in this kitchen that smelled like someone had cooked here for decades. "Show me the room," she said. He stood. He walked her upstairs, down a hall with photographs on the wall. Family photographs, unposed, the kind that accumulate over years in houses where people actually live, and stopped at a door and opened it and stood back so she went in first. The room was simple. A bed, a lamp, towels folded on the chair. A window that looked on to the vineyard, black now but implying itself in rows beyond the glass. "Damien." She stood at the window, back to him. "Yes." "What is Drell planning? Not the surveillance, not the reconnaissance. What does Carver actually think comes next?" The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of a man deciding whether to answer a question honestly when the honest answer was going to change things. "There's a charity gala," he said. 3 weeks. Major event. Half the city's power structure in one room. Drell has people on the guest list." Another pause. "Our intelligence is that he's planning something there. Public. Designed to send a message." She turned. "What kind of message?" Damien's jaw was tight in the way it got when he was holding something at the containment line. "The kind," he said, "that involves making sure I understand what it costs to keep fighting him." She understood what he meant. She felt it in the base of her sternum, a cold settling, not quite fear, the thing that lives just before fear when you understand what the fear is going to be about. "He's going to use me," she said, "at the gala, in public, in front of everyone. That's our current intelligence. And your plan?" Damien looked at her. In the doorway, with the hall light behind him and the dark vineyard behind her, he looked, she thought, in the part of her mind that refused to stop noticing things, like a man who was being honest at considerable personal cost. "I'm still working on it," he said. She nodded. "Go to sleep," she said. "You look terrible." Something crossed his face then. Not the fear, not the containment, but something lower and quieter, something that might have been the closest he got to unguarded. "There are people on the perimeter," he said. "You're safe here." "I know," she said. He pulled the door closed. She stood in the dark room and listened to his footsteps recede down the hall, and thought about a charity gala 3 weeks away, and a man who didn't negotiate, and a plan that wasn't finished yet. And she thought about the photographs on the wall in the hallway. Family, unposed, the residue of a life lived in actual rooms. And she thought about her own apartment, where the security footage had a 4-minute gap on a Wednesday night, and someone had stood in her home in the dark and memorized the layout. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed her palms flat on her knees. She made herself think clearly, methodically, the way she always thought when the thing she was looking at was too large to look at all at once. Break it into parts, examine each part, find the logic in the sequence. The logic in this sequence was, Drell had decided she was the most effective way to reach Damien. Drell had found her before Damien's people fully anticipated it. Drell had a plan that involved a public venue and 3 weeks of preparation. And the man down the hall, who had more resources and more experience, and more of the specific kind of ruthless intelligence that situations like this required, had told her his plan was still in progress. which meant there was a window. And windows were, in her experience, the most dangerous part of any structure, the place where things that had no business getting in could find a way through. She lay down on top of the covers, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling the way she'd stared at her own ceiling that morning, which felt like it belonged to a different week. It was the last ordinary morning she'd had. She understood that now. Everything going forward was going to require something from her that ordinary mornings hadn't. A different kind of attention, a different kind of steadiness, a willingness to operate in a world she'd spent 4 years adjacent to without ever quite being inside. She was inside it now. The door had locked behind her while she wasn't looking, and the only question that remained was not how to get back out, but whether the woman she'd been on the other side of it was going to be sufficient for what was waiting on. She was awake before dawn, not because anything woke her, no sound, no movement, nothing external, just her body deciding that sleep was finished, the way it had been deciding that for months, with the particular authority of a system that had stopped trusting stillness. She lay in the dark room and listened to the vineyard. It had a sound, she discovered, a very faint sound, the kind you only heard when everything else was quiet enough. Wind moving through the rows, the distant settling of a structure that had been standing long enough to have opinions about temperature changes. A bird, somewhere, practicing the specific two-note call that birds use before they're sure anyone is listening. She thought about what came next. Not emotionally, practically. The way she thought about everything that mattered. Break it into components, examine the logic, find where the gaps were. 3 weeks to the gala. Drill with people on the guest list, a plan that Damien was still building. Her own position, visible now, targeted now, inside a situation she hadn't entered voluntarily but was in regardless. And the only question worth asking about an involuntary position was what you were going to do with it. She got up, washed her face, went downstairs. Elena was already in the kitchen. Coffee was already made. There was bread on the table and preserves from a jar without a label that turned out to be fig, which was not what Sienna expected, and was also, unreasonably, exactly right. "Sit," Elena said, as though Sienna had been eating in this kitchen for years. She sat. They did not talk about Drell or the gala or the sedan that had followed her home or the 4-minute gap in her building's security feed. They talked about the vineyard. Elena's father had planted the first rows. Elena's husband had expanded it. Damien had modernized the infrastructure 15 years ago in a way that Elena described with the particular mix of pride and mild exasperation that mothers reserved for competent children who did things their own way. "He doesn't ask for help," Sienna said. "Not a complaint. An observation." Elena looked at her over the rim of her cup. "No, he never has." She set the cup down. His father was the same. Men in this family, they carry things. It's not stubbornness. It's... She paused, searching. They don't believe anyone should have to carry what they can carry themselves. "That's a generous interpretation," Sienna said. Elena smiled. It transformed her face entirely. 20 years younger in a single movement, and Sienna could see, suddenly, exactly what Damien's resting expression would have looked like before whatever had arranged it into its current controlled form. "It's an accurate one," Elena said. "Whether it's generous depends on where you're standing." Damien came down at 6:30 with the look of a man who had slept for perhaps 3 hours and had already been on the phone for the hour preceding that. He looked at Sienna at his mother's table, and the thing that moved across his face was too quick for her to name, and she was getting tired of things moving across his face too quickly to name. "Carver needs us both on a call at 7, he said. "Both," she said. "I'm done making decisions without you in the room," he said. Simple. No preamble. She looked at him for a moment. "Then pour yourself coffee," she said, "and sit down, because it's not 7 yet." He poured coffee. He sat down. Elena watched both of them with the serene attention of a woman who had been watching people arrange themselves around each other for 60 years and had learned to recognize the architecture. Though the 7 o'clock call had 8 people on it, which told Sienna this was not a standard briefing. Carver's voice was clipped in the way it got when he'd been managing multiple threads simultaneously and was working to keep them from tangling. Aldridge was on the call. Reston. Three people Sienna hadn't met, introduced by role rather than name, two field operatives, and a woman Carver referred to only as their inside contact, which Sienna understood was all the identification she was going to get. The picture that assembled itself over the next 40 minutes was this. Drell had moved his timeline. Not 3 weeks, 10 days. Someone inside the gala's planning committee had shifted the event date due to a venue conflict, and the new date aligned with a window Drell's people had apparently already prepared for. The change had happened 48 hours ago. The inside contact had confirmed it 6 hours ago. They had been building the wrong timeline. "What's on day 10 that isn't on day 23? Damien asked. "The venue layout is different," the inside contact said. Her voice had an accent Sienna couldn't place, deliberately flat, the voice of someone trained to be unfamiliar. The original date had the main ballroom. The new date is the atrium and the rooftop terrace. Open plan, multiple access points. How many people on their confirmed list? 6 on the floor, possibly more we haven't identified. A pause. And they have an invitation. Silence on the line. Who? Damien's voice had dropped in a register that Sienna had not heard from him before. Not louder, lower. The difference between a warning and a consequence. The man who sold the invitation is a junior member of the gala committee. We're told it was financial. He didn't know what he was selling it to. Who has it now? We believe Drell himself plans to attend. Another silence. Longer. Sienna understood what that meant without being told. Victor Drell attending in person was not an operational decision. It was a statement. The man who sent people to walk through her apartment in the dark, who placed a car outside her building, who had engineered a dinner date through 2 degrees of separation, coming into a room full of the city's most visible people and making something happen there, in front of all of them, was the kind of thing you only did when you were delivering a message that needed an audience. "What does he want in that room?" she asked. A beat. She wasn't sure if they were surprised she'd spoken or simply recalibrating. "He wants Damien to make a choice," Carver said. "In public, in front of everyone. Stand down, give up the shipping network, or," he paused, "or the evening ends in a way that makes the point for him." "He's going to threaten me in a room full of witnesses," she said. "More than threaten," the inside contact said quietly. "Our information is that his people have instructions to act, not negotiate, if Mr. Moretti refuses." Sienna looked at Damien across the table. He was looking back at her. His hands were flat on the surface in front of him, completely still, and his jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle in it, and his eyes had the quality they got when he was running calculations at a speed that didn't show on the surface. "We have 10 days, Sienna said. "What's the plan?" The plan, as it assembled itself over the next 72 hours at the vineyard, was not simple, and Sienna was in every meeting. Damien had meant what he said about not making decisions without her in the room. He said it once and then demonstrated it continuously, pulling a chair up to the table, not for her, not the gesture of someone making accommodation, but as though it had always been there and she had always been sitting in it. His people adapted to her presence with varying degrees of smoothness, but they adapted, and by the second day she noticed that Carver was sometimes directing questions to her that were not hers professionally to answer, and she was answering them, and the answers were good. She was, it turned out, very useful in a crisis. She had always known this about herself in professional contexts. She had not known how far the competence extended until she was sitting in a room where the context was someone planning to make an example of her in a public ballroom. Turns out, it extended pretty far. She identified a gap in their perimeter plan on day 2, a service corridor that appeared on none of the venue maps they'd been working from because it had been added during a renovation that predated the current management's records. She found it because she had attended this gala 3 years running as Damien's professional representative and had once, during a very tedious cocktail hour, walked the entire building out of sheer boredom. Carver looked at the corridor on the blueprint she'd pulled and said, "That's a problem." "It's also an opportunity," she said. "Depends which side of it you're on." Damien looked at the blueprints and then at her with an expression that had become familiar over 3 days, the one that meant he was revising a calculation he'd thought was complete. By day 4, she had stopped thinking of the vineyard as a place she'd been taken to and started thinking of it as a place she was working from. The distinction felt important, even if she couldn't have articulated exactly why. Elena fed everyone. She moved through the rooms with plates and cups without appearing to notice the maps on the table or the low-voiced phone calls or the way conversations sometimes stopped when she entered, and she pretended not to notice that too. On the 4th evening, she put a bowl of pasta in front of Sienna and said quietly, in Italian-edged English, "He looks at you when he thinks no one is looking at him. He has been doing this for a very long time." Sienna looked at the pasta. "I know," she said. "And?" Elena said, "and I'm still thinking about it." Elena made the sound again, the one that was not quite a laugh and not quite exasperation. "Take your time," she said, patting Sienna's shoulder once, the kind of pat that meant she thought she was being patient, when in fact she'd already made up her mind. Then she went back to the kitchen. Day 7. 3 days before the gala. The plan was as solid as it was going to get, which was not as solid as Sienna would have preferred, because the variables they couldn't control outnumbered the ones they could. Drell's precise head count, the exact sequence of his play, whether the junior committee member who'd sold the invitation had passed any additional information. Sienna was in the East Room they'd been using as a command space, going through the guest list for the 4th time, when her phone rang. Private number. She almost didn't answer. Then something, instinct, or the particular way the day had felt since morning, too quiet, like air before weather, made her pick up. "Ms. Cross." The voice was male, moderate, the voice of someone who had practiced sounding unremarkable. "I think you and I should speak before next Friday." Her hand did not tighten on the phone. She made sure of that. "Who is this?" she said. "Someone who would like the evening to end without casualties." A pause. "Mr. Drell wanted me to make clear that his issue is not with you personally. You're a means to a conversation. If Mr. Moretti agrees to the terms, you go home unharmed. And if he doesn't, then the evening becomes complicated." She kept her voice completely even. "You're calling me to tell me I'm being used as a bargaining chip. I'm aware. Is there a point?" A slight pause. She'd surprised him. "Good." "The point," the voice said, "is that you have influence with Moretti that his associates don't. We believe, if you understood the full scope of what Drell is asking, you might find it reasonable to... You want me to convince him to give you what you want. We want everyone to walk out of that room, including your 6 people on the floor." Another pause. Longer. "You're well informed," the voice said. "Tell Mr. Drell," she said, "that his read on my influence with Mr. Moretti is accurate, and tell him that's exactly why I'm going to be in that room." She paused. "And that the conversation he wants to have with Damien Moretti about terms, he can have it with me first." She ended the call. Her heart was going at a rate that was not normal. She sat with that for exactly 4 seconds. Then she went to find Damien. He was at the other end of the house, in a room she hadn't been in before. Smaller, with bookshelves and a desk that looked like it had been used for actual work rather than aesthetics, and a window looking onto the north end of the vineyard, where the rows were older and the vines thicker. He was on a call when she came to the door. He ended it when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She watched his expression move through several things in rapid succession. A flash of something cold, a tightening that started at the jaw and moved through his shoulders, and then, landing beneath all of it like a foundation, something that was simply fury, contained, enormous. "He called you directly," Damien said. "He wanted me to talk you into compliance." "He called you directly." He said it again, not to her, to some internal accounting he was running. He stood from the chair, moved to the window. His hands were in his pockets, which she'd learned was what he did with them when he didn't trust what they'd do otherwise. "He doesn't make contact. He uses layers. If he called you directly, he's closer than we thought," she said. "He has someone in our communication somewhere." Damien's voice was flat. "He knew your number. He knew enough about our setup to know you'd have value as a messenger. Someone in our circle gave him a picture of our operation. He turned. Someone we trusted. The room went very still. Sienna thought about the 8 people on the 7 o'clock call, the field operatives she hadn't met, the inside contact with the unfamiliar voice, Reston, who'd been in the conference room when Sienna was told her apartment had been swept, Carver, who had been on every call, in every room. "You don't know who?" she said. "No." He said it like a man swallowing something with edges. "Not yet." "Then we have a timeline problem," she said. 3 days, a compromised communication channel, and someone in our own people who's been feeding information to the man who wants to use me to end you." He looked at her. "Yes." "Then we cut the channel," she said. "Right now. Anyone who's been on a call in the last 72 hours goes dark. We rebuild with a smaller circle, people you would put your life on, not your operation on. Your life on." "That's 4 people," he said immediately, which told her he'd already run the same calculation and arrived at the same number, and the fact that he'd done it that fast meant he'd been thinking about it before she walked in. "Then we work with 4 people," she said, "and we figure out what we're walking into in 3 days without telling anyone we've figured it out." He was quiet for a moment. "You said we," he said. "I did." "You're not—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't going to ask you to be in that room, Sienna. The plan we were building had you—" "Had me where? Safe in the vineyard while you walked into an event you know has 6 of his people on the floor and a man you can't fully predict at the center of it?" She held his gaze. "I told Drell's man I'd be there. I told him I'd speak to Drell first. That's not something I said to be brave. That's something I said because if Drell believes I'm there willingly, it changes his read on Damien's position. It changes the calculus." Damien was very still. "You're talking about using yourself as a variable," he said. "I'm talking about being useful instead of protected." She moved to the desk, picked up the pen lying on it, set it down, the nervous gesture of someone who was working out the last piece of an argument while making it. "You've been trying to keep me out of this. Drell has been trying to put me in the middle of it. Between those 2 things, I've been—" She paused. "I've been a piece being moved. I'm tired of that. It's not the same as being ready for what's in that room." "No," she agreed, "but I'm not going to be ready by staying here, and you know that, and I think you also know that your plan with 4 people and a compromised information channel and an opponent who just demonstrated he's close enough to call my personal number is significantly more stable if I'm in it." He looked at her for a long time. The vineyard was outside the window, still in the early morning. The house was quiet around them in the way old houses were quiet. Not absence of sound, but presence of weight, of accumulated time. "I need you to understand what Drell is capable of," he said. "Not the summary version, the full version." "Tell me," she said. He told her. It took 20 minutes and was not summary set. It was the unredacted account of a man who removed obstacles the way other men changed lanes. It was specific, and it was ugly, and it was delivered without flourish, which made it worse, because horror dressed in plain language sat in the chest differently than horror dressed in drama. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "I'm not saying it doesn't change things. It changes things, but it doesn't change the math." She straightened. "Who are the 4 people?" He said 4 names. Carver was on the list, which told her his instinct about the leak didn't point there. She filed that. "Then let's get them on a call," she said. "A different channel. And let's build this from the beginning." They had 3 days. The 4-person circle held. No leaks, no contact from Drell's people suggesting they detected the channel change. Either the leak was someone outside the new circle, or they were waiting, and waiting was fine. Waiting meant Drell still believed his picture of their operation was accurate, which was the only advantage they had. The night before the gala, Sienna stood in the room at the vineyard for what she knew was the last time and looked at herself in the mirror behind the door. She had a dress she'd brought. She'd thought ahead. Even in the dark at 2 a.m., she'd thought to grab the garment bag hanging on her closet door, the dress she'd bought for the original gala date and never worn, black, long, the kind of dress that looked quiet until you moved in it. She looked at herself for a long moment. She looked like a woman about to walk into something. That was accurate. A knock at the door. She knew the rhythm of it. "Come in," she said. Damien opened the door and stood at the threshold and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for 3 days, with the attention of a man who kept checking an equation and kept arriving at the same answer and kept being slightly undone by it. "I need you to know something," he said. "If it's operational, it's not." He stayed in the doorway. "Tomorrow, whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that the last 3 days have been the first time in a very long time that I've been working with someone instead of around them." He paused. "I didn't know what that felt like. I should have known earlier. I'm sorry it took—" He stopped. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. "Are you apologizing for the Instagram comment?" she said. Something moved through his expression, the closest thing to surprise she'd ever seen on his face. "Among other things," he said. "The Instagram comment," she said, "is the least of your debts." "I know. We can argue about the rest when this is over." "All right." "Damien." She turned back to the mirror. "Go get some sleep. You look terrible again." She heard it, just barely, just at the edge of audible. The thing that was maybe a laugh, private and quiet, the sound a man makes when he's felt something he didn't expect to feel. The door closed. She stood in front of the mirror a moment longer. Then she turned off the light and lay down in the dark and made herself think about tomorrow. Not the fear of it, not the shape of what Drell was capable of, but the sequence. The service corridor. The 4 people. The dress that looked quiet until you moved. She thought about what it meant to stop being a piece being moved and start being a player making the moves. She was still thinking about it when she finally, against all probability, fell asleep. The night of the gala. The atrium of the Whitmore building on Park Avenue was what it always was during this event, the kind of beautiful that required 3 months of planning to look effortless. Flowers banked against every surface, candlelight at a warmth that softened everyone, a string quartet working through something classical at a volume that was present without being intrusive, the oral equivalent of expensive wallpaper. The guest list was 400 people, senators, CEOs, philanthropists, the specific tier of New York's social infrastructure that ran on old money and new visibility, and the shared understanding that certain rooms were about being seen, and being seen in them was the point. Sienna arrived with Damien, not behind him, not ahead of him, beside him. She felt the moment the room registered them, not an audible reaction, more the way a current changes when something new enters the water. Eyes moved. Conversations completed their current sentences and then paused. Bones emerged. Damien walked through it the way he walked through every room, without adjusting to what the room expected, which was the only way to walk through rooms like this with any kind of authority. Sienna walked through it the same way. She hadn't planned to. It simply turned out to be the way she walked. They were 12 minutes in. 12 minutes of the particular choreography of a high-stakes social event, handshakes and introductions, and the management of space, when Sienna felt it. Not saw, felt. The change in the room's texture that comes when something has shifted in the balance of attention, and whoever shifted it isn't announcing themselves. She scanned without appearing to scan. Carver's voice came quietly through the earpiece she'd accepted after exactly one argument. Northeast corner, gray suit. "He's here." She did not look at the northeast corner. She felt Damien's hand find the small of her back. Not possessive, not the gesture it might have looked like from across the room. The gesture of 2 people in a situation who have agreed on a signal and just used it. His palm was warm through the fabric of her dress, and she felt her own heart respond to it in ways that had nothing to do with the operational significance of the moment and everything to do with the 3 days they'd just spent, and the man she'd been watching revise himself, and the word he'd written 7 times beneath photos she hadn't consented to, and the fact that she was here, in this room, beside him, because she'd chosen to be. "He's moving," Damien said. Quiet. Just for her. "I know," she said. "You don't have to be the one to—" "I know," she said again. She turned toward the northeast corner. Victor Drell was not what she'd built in her imagination over 10 days of preparation. He was shorter than she'd expected, late 50s, with a face that would have been entirely forgettable in any other context. Mild, pleasant even, the face of a man who ran a hardware chain or coached a community soccer team. The gray suit was well made without being remarkable. He was holding a glass of champagne he hadn't drunk from. He looked at her as she approached. He smiled. It was a practiced smile. The specific warmth of someone who had learned that warmth was the most disarming thing a dangerous person could project. "Miss Cross," he said, "I was hoping you'd come over." "Were you?" she said. "I meant what my associate told you. This evening doesn't need to be unpleasant." He glanced past her at Damien, who had not followed her, who was 30 feet back, talking to a senator, maintaining the appearance that this was a coincidental conversation. "Mr. Moretti is a practical man. Practical men understand trade-offs." "Tell me the trade-off," she said. "The Moretti Group's shipping network, the Eastern Corridor specifically, the infrastructure, the contacts, the transit routing, transferred within 30 days. In exchange, his operation continues without interference. His family," Drell's eyes went to her briefly, "remains unharmed." "His family," she repeated. "Everyone he values," Drell said. The smile stayed. "We're not unreasonable people." Sienna looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Drell," she said, "the man who called me offered me a version of this where I was the reason Damien Moretti stood down. You thought I'd be afraid enough to use whatever influence you assumed I had to end this for you." She tilted her head slightly. "What made you think I'd be afraid?" The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it did. "You should be," he said, and the mild pleasantness of his voice hadn't changed, which was what made it land the way it did. Not a threat dressed as a threat, but a fact delivered in the same register as the weather. "Maybe," she said. "But here's what I know about the next 20 minutes that you don't." His eyes narrowed, just slightly. "You're 6 people on the floor. We identified 5 of them in the first 8 minutes. The 6th we identified from your guest list this morning. They've been watching my team watch them for the last hour." She kept her voice conversational. "The service corridor on the east side, the one that's not on the standard building maps, has been controlled by our people since 9:15. Every exit from this atrium is currently monitored by someone who answers to Damien Moretti." She paused. "And the evidence package that your organization spent 18 months assuming didn't exist? It was transmitted to the Federal Organized Crime Division at 8:47 this evening. They're waiting for a confirmation call that this conversation happened before they move." Victor Drell was very still. The smile was gone. "You came here," he said, and his voice had dropped, the pleasant register gone. Something underneath it that was cold and flat, and was the real version of the man. "To deliver a message." "No," she said. "I came here because I chose to." "There's a difference." She held his gaze. "You spent 10 days trying to make me a variable in your equation. I spent 10 days making myself the solution to—" Victor Drell looked at her for a long moment. The atrium moved around them. 400 people who had no idea that the most consequential conversation in the room was happening between a woman in a black dress and a mild-faced man with an untouched glass of champagne, 12 feet from the string quartet, beneath a chandelier that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. He looked at her the way men who were accustomed to having leverage looked at the moment it left their hands, with a specific kind of stillness that was not calm, but was the thing that came right before a decision. "You're bluffing," he said. "Call it," she said. He didn't move for 4 seconds. She counted them. Then his hand went into his jacket pocket. Not for a weapon, she registered that instantly. The movement was too deliberate, too controlled, and came out with a phone. He looked at the screen. Something changed in his face. The mildness didn't come back. What replaced it was older and harder. The face underneath the face, the one that had made the decisions that had brought him to this room and this moment, and the specific position of a man who has just understood that the architecture he built has been entered from a direction he didn't account for. He knew. Whatever confirmation he was checking, a message from one of his people, an absence of a message, the silence where an all clear should have been, he knew. He put the phone back in his pocket. "The federal contact," he said. Vargas? I don't know the name, she said, which was true. She'd been kept out of that specific layer deliberately, and she'd agreed to it, because there were things in this that were Damien's to manage, and she'd learned over 10 days to know the difference between what was hers to carry and what wasn't. Smart, Drell said, not a compliment, an assessment. He kept you clean. His eyes moved past her again to Damien across the room, who was still talking to the senator, whose posture had not changed in the entire duration of this conversation, who was doing what he did better than almost anyone she'd ever watched do it, holding every thread without showing a single one. He's been building this for a long time. Yes, she said. The shipping network was never the real target, Drell said, and something in his voice had changed again. The cold, flat register was gone, replaced by something she didn't have a clean name for. Not defeat. More like the specific exhaustion of a man who has been running a long operation and has just found its boundary. He was building a case. He was protecting what was his, she said. The word landed differently than she'd intended. She felt it as she said it. The echo of a word written 7 times beneath photographs she hadn't consented to, the word she'd spent weeks being furious about, the word she now understood had never been about ownership at all, but about this. A man who had identified something he valued and had been, in his own flawed and unilateral and occasionally maddening way, building walls around it before she even knew she needed them. Drell looked at her. You were supposed to be the pressure point, he said. I know. You were supposed to make him hesitate. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. The string quartet finished something and began something else, seamless, the music continuous beneath the evening like a current. Instead, he said, you became the closer. She didn't answer. He set his champagne glass on a passing tray without looking at it, the gesture of a man who was done with the performance of the evening. Then he straightened his jacket, the slight adjustment of a person resetting themselves, and he looked at her one more time with the old-faced look beneath the mild one. Tell Moretti, he said, that I don't do this often. Do what? Recognize when I've lost cleanly. He held her gaze. It's rare. He turned and walked toward the main entrance with the unhurried pace of a man who was choosing to leave rather than being removed, and that distinction, she understood, was the only pride he had left in the room, and she let him keep it because it cost her nothing, and because she was tired suddenly and completely, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Carver's voice in her ear. He's moving to the exit. Our people have him. Federal team is staged on the street. A pause. That was well done, Ms. Cross. She didn't respond to that. She stood in the middle of the Whitmore atrium for exactly 3 seconds, surrounded by 400 people who still didn't know what had just happened, and she breathed. Then Damien was beside her. She hadn't seen him move. He was simply there. The way he was simply there, she was realizing, with a consistency that she'd been cataloging without admitting she was cataloging it. The senator was gone. His face was composed in the way it got when he was managing the gap between what was happening internally and what was visible externally, and she knew that face well enough now to see both sides of it. It's done, he said. Quiet. Only for her. He's walking out, she said. Federal team is on the street. Something moved through him. Not visible to anyone watching from the room, she was certain of that. He was too controlled for it to be visible, but she was close enough to feel it. The specific release of a person setting down a weight they've been carrying long enough that they've forgotten what it feels like to not be carrying it. Sienna, not here, she said. He nodded, once. And they stood beside each other in the middle of a charity gala while the string quartet played and the champagne moved through the room on trays, and 400 people who ran the city talked about things that were not this. And outside on Park Avenue, a mild-faced man in a gray suit was being met by federal agents who had been waiting for a phone call that had come in at 8:47, and the empire he'd spent 20 years building was beginning, quietly, to come apart at the seams. The arrest did not make the evening news that night. It made the morning news, which was worse for Drell and better for everyone else, because morning news had longer cycles and more column inches, and the specific grinding thoroughness of journalism that had time to get the details right. By 6 a.m., 3 networks had the story. By 8, The financial implications were running in the business press. By noon, 3 of Drell's subsidiary structures had been frozen, and 2 of his senior associates had engaged lawyers. Sienna read the coverage at Eddie's corner cart on a Thursday morning, medium dark roast, lid not quite sealed, cup held at the angle she'd been holding it for 3 years. The cart was 3 blocks from the Moretti Group building, which she was walking back toward, because she had a 9 o'clock meeting she'd scheduled 2 weeks ago, and she had no intention of missing it because the previous 12 days had contained more adrenaline than she was accustomed to processing. Eddie handed her the cup and said, "You okay?" "Getting there," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in a week who wasn't Damien. She walked. The city was doing what the city did. The garbage trucks and the commuters and the coffee smell and the particular morning quality of Manhattan light that made everything look slightly more possible than it probably was. She'd walked this block 5,000 times. She walked it now and felt it differently and didn't try to decide if that was good or bad. Because some changes didn't have a valence, they just were. The 9 o'clock meeting was about the subsidiary acquisition that had been in process since February and still hadn't resolved itself. And Sienna ran it with her usual precision, and at the end of it the lead attorney from the other side said, slightly dazedly, "I think we've made more progress in the last hour than we have in 8 months." And Sienna said, "Prep the revised terms and get them to me by Friday." And that was that. She was back at her desk by 10:30. At 11, Troy called from upstairs and said Mr. Moretti was asking if she had a few minutes. "He can come down," she said. A pause. Troy started, and she could hear him working through the protocol question, because in 4 years the dynamic had always been the other direction. "Sure. Yes. I'll let him know." Damien came down at 11:15. He walked through the open plan office with the same quality he always had in any room, the room adjusting slightly around him without his appearing to notice. And he came to her desk and he stood there, which he never did, which meant he hadn't decided yet how this conversation started. She looked up from her screen. "Sit down," she said. "You're making people nervous standing there." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair where lawyers and counterparties and nervous junior executives usually sat. And he looked at her and she looked at him, and the morning came through the window behind her, and the office did its thing around them, ambient and continuous. "Reston," he said. She'd been waiting for this. "He was the leak," she said. Not a question. Confirmed this morning, he'd been feeding Drell's people operational information for 11 months. Damien's voice was flat in the way it got when something had cost him something real. 15 years. I've known him 15 years. She didn't say anything immediately. There wasn't a version of that sentence that responded too quickly. "Is he?" she started. "Federal," Damien said. "He's part of the package. He made a deal last night before we knew he'd done it, which means he knew we'd find him, which means he's been preparing his exit longer than we realized." She thought about Reston in the conference room 10 days ago, looking uncertain. She'd read it as a man uncomfortable with the situation. She understood now she'd been reading the wrong discomfort. "I'm sorry," she said. Damien looked at the desk between them. 15 years, he said again. Not to her. To the accounting of it. "Damien?" She waited until he looked up. "You didn't miss it because you were careless. You missed it because he was careful. There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment. "You say that the same way you said I was right about the apartment," he said, "because both things are true, and you're sitting with them the same way, like they're verdicts. Aren't they?" "They're facts," she said. "Facts have different weight than verdicts. Verdicts are about what you deserve. Facts are just what happened." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to be insufferable to argue with," he said. "I always was," she said. "You're only noticing now because you're paying different attention." Something shifted in his expression, the move toward unguarded that she'd been seeing more of, each time slightly less brief than the last. The man under the containment becoming incrementally more visible as the necessity of the containment became incrementally less total. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "Not here." He glanced at the office around them, the open plan, the ambient noise, the 12 people within sightline who were all pretending not to watch this conversation with their entire peripheral attention. "Tonight, if you're..." He paused. The pause of a man choosing his words with care, but not the care of strategy. The care of someone who doesn't want to get it wrong. If you're willing. She looked at him. In 4 years, she had responded to 1,000 versions of his requests. For meetings, for information, for the management of situations that required exactly the kind of precise, principled judgment she'd been providing him since she walked through the door. She'd responded to all of them as his employee, which was what she'd been, which was what had made the relationship workable and clean and bounded. She was looking at him now, and the boundary was not what it had been, and they both knew that, and there was something clarifying and terrifying about the mutual knowing of it. 7 o'clock, she said. Not the office. No, he agreed. Somewhere that isn't work. Yes. And Damien. She picked up her pen. Bring your actual self, not the executive, not the... She searched. Not the version you bring to rooms where you need to be in control of the outcome. The other one. He looked at her for a moment. I'll try, he said. That's all I'm asking. He stood. He straightened his jacket, the habitual gesture, the small reset, and he looked at her one more time with the look that she'd stopped trying to file away and started simply receiving, because some things didn't need to be dealt with later. They needed to be acknowledged in the moment they occurred. He left. She turned back to her screen. She sat there for 30 seconds doing nothing, which for Sienna Cross was approximately 29 seconds longer than usual. Then she went back to work. They met at a restaurant on the west side that neither of them had been to before, which had been her criterion and which he had met without asking why, which told her he understood the criterion. A place with no history between them, no associations, no version of them that had already happened there. He was there when she arrived. She was exactly on time, which she always was, and he was early, which she was learning he always was, though she'd never registered it before as a preference rather than a schedule. He stood when she came to the table, which she didn't need him to do and which he did anyway, not with the performative gallantry of a man executing a gesture, but with the reflex of someone who'd been raised to stand up when a person they valued came into the room. She sat. He sat. The restaurant was warm and not too loud and had the quality of a place chosen for exactly the reasons it had been chosen. They ordered. The waiter left. The evening settled around them. Tell me something true, she said. He looked at her. About what? About yourself. Something that isn't about the operation or the company or any of the things that are also true but that you use when you don't want to say the harder thing. He was quiet for a moment. I've been alone for a long time, he said. By design. I told myself it was practical. Fewer vulnerabilities, cleaner decision-making, no one who could be used against me. He picked up his water glass and set it back down without drinking from it. I told myself that for long enough that I stopped noticing I was telling it to myself. When did you stop not noticing? She said. 18 months ago, he said, approximately. There was a meeting. You had prepared a file for it. The Harwick negotiation, and the brief you wrote was better than anything my legal team had produced, and you knew it, and you didn't say so. You just put it on the table and let the work speak and watch the room figure it out. He paused. I watched you watch the room, and I understood, somewhere in the part of me that I'd apparently stopped listening to, that I was in serious trouble. She looked at him. You were in trouble 18 months ago, she said, and your response was to write mine on the internet. The corner of his mouth moved. The closest she'd seen him come to a smile that was genuinely unguarded. My response for 18 months was to do nothing, he said. The Instagram comment was an extremely poor improvisation. It really was. Yes. It worked, though, she said, in the specific technical sense that it accomplished the operational goal. At considerable cost to my dignity. You have an enormous amount of dignity, she said. You can afford to spend some. He looked at her across the table with the undone look, fully out now, not brief, not filed away. And she let herself look back at it with the same honesty, because she was tired of looking sideways at things that deserved to be looked at directly. I don't know how to do this, he said. Whatever this is, I know how to run operations. I know how to manage risk and read rooms and make decisions under pressure. I don't know how to... He stopped. I don't know how to be someone's in the way that's actually mutual. In the way where you're also mine. Not in the sense I know what you mean, she said. I don't want to get it wrong. You will, she said. So will I. That's not the question. She set her fork down. The question is whether you tell me when you get it wrong instead of managing the information to protect me from the discomfort of knowing. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, I can do that. And when I tell you you're wrong, I'll listen, he said. Not perform listening. Actually, listen. And when your instinct is to make a decision about my life without asking me, I'll ask, he said. Or I'll tell you in the same breath that I'm making it, so that we can argue about it in real time instead of after. She looked at him. That's the most realistic set of promises you could have made, she said. Anyone else would have promised to be perfect. I've watched you deal with perfect, he said. I didn't think you'd believe it. She picked up her wine. He picked up his. Damien, she said. Yes. The word. She looked at her glass. On the posts. I need you to tell me, not the operational reason, not the 18 months of it being true before you said it. I need you to tell me what you meant when you wrote it. He didn't answer immediately. She waited, because she'd learned that his silences were not avoidance. They were the sound of a man being careful with something that mattered. I meant, he said, that you were not available to be reduced, not by a man with a camera and a caption, not by people who would look at those photographs and see someone decorative, not by Drell, not by anyone who thought you were a means to something. His voice was steady, completely steady. I meant that I saw you, what you actually were, and I was not willing to watch the world see something smaller and not say anything. He paused. It was the wrong word. Possessive is the wrong frame entirely for what I meant, but I didn't have the right word yet. I wrote the only one I had. She was quiet for a moment. You could have called me, she said. At 11:47 at night. Yes. And said what? She thought about it. What would he have said in a phone call to a woman he'd been not saying something to for 18 months while the internet was detonating around a photograph she hadn't posed for? Fair point, she said. I will never write a possessive pronoun on your social media again, he said. I want to be very clear about that. Good. I may, however, call you at 11:47 at night. That, she said, is negotiable. The evening moved around them. They ate, they talked. Not about the operation, not about Drell or Reston or Meridian Capital, not about the things that had structured the last 12 days. About other things. His mother's vineyard and how she'd planted a new row the spring after his father died, and how the vines hadn't produced well for the first 2 years, and then, in the third, had come back better than the rows his father had planted, which Elena had never claimed to find symbolic, and which clearly was. About Sienna's sister in Chicago, who had 2 kids and a mortgage and a husband who coached youth baseball and who was in almost every respect living the kind of life that was exactly opposite to Sienna's, and whom Sienna loved with a totality that she found slightly inconvenient because it meant she couldn't be entirely cynical about the concept of stability, about what it was like to spend 4 years in adjacent rooms with someone and know them completely in one dimension and not at all in the one that mattered most. I knew your coffee order on your second day, he said. You'd read my file, she said. I'd read your file. I knew you took it black. I still made sure the kitchen ordered the specific roast you mentioned once in a meeting about the catering contract. He said it simply, without drama. A fact. I told myself it was about performance management. She looked at him. That is the most Damien Moretti thing I have ever heard, she said. I'm aware. You micromanaged my coffee for 4 years as a displacement behavior. That is an accurate summary. You are not a simple man. No, he said. I'm really not. She picked up her glass. I'm not a simple woman. No, he said. That's one of the things. What things? The things, he said, that I have apparently been cataloging without admitting I was cataloging them. She set the glass down. She looked at him across the table in a restaurant on the west side that neither of them had history in, with the evening full and warm around them and the world outside continuing its business, indifferent and continuous. And she thought about a word written 7 times beneath photographs she hadn't consented to, and about a kitchen at a vineyard that smelled like decades of use, and about a hallway with unposed photographs, and about a man who had rebuilt his communication infrastructure in 72 hours because she told him it needed rebuilding, and about the specific quality of his hand at the small of her back in a ballroom when everything was about to change, which had been simultaneously professional and not professional at all. She thought about Daniel, who had kept things from her to protect her from discomfort, and had thereby made her smaller in the shape of his life, without either of them noticing until the shape was all that was left. She thought about this version of moving on that she'd been performing when Marcus Hale had come to dinner. The going through motions of a woman trying to convince herself that forward was the direction she was traveling in. She thought about being a piece being moved versus being the solution. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay," she said again. "I'm not saying this is simple or that I'm not going to push back on you constantly. I'd be concerned if you didn't. Or that there aren't about 14 conversations we still need to have. Probably more. But okay." She looked at him. "I'm saying okay." He was very still for a moment. Then, "That's the most carefully qualified yes I've ever received." "You're lucky you got it," she said. "I know," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, direct, with the full weight of a man who understood exactly what he was being given and had no intention of treating it as anything less than what it was, landed in her chest and stayed there. 3 months later. The Moretti Group headquarters reopened after a 2-week renovation, smaller than the word implied, a refresh of the lobby and the 38th floor, the kind of change that was physical but meant something else. The company had restructured in the week since the gala, a new compliance framework, a new senior advisor replacing Reston, a legal settlement with 3 subsidiary entities that had been unknowingly entangled in the Drell network. None of it was clean. Clean was not the word for the aftermath of something like this. Thorough was closer. Honest was closer still. Sienna stood in the renovated lobby on the morning of the reopening, coffee from Eddie's cart at the right angle, and she thought about a Tuesday morning 3 months ago when she'd walked through this lobby with her composed walk and her carefully neutral expression and a phone full of notifications about a word a man had written on the internet. The composed walk was still there. It was hers. It would always be hers. It wasn't performance. It was simply how she moved through the world because it was how she'd learned to. But the careful neutrality had been replaced by something else, something that was not its opposite, not openness, not softness, but was more like accuracy. She was, she understood now, more precisely herself than she'd been 3 months ago. The pretending had narrowed, and what was left was something that fit better. Elena had called the previous Sunday. They had been talking for 20 minutes before Sienna registered that she was not talking to her employer's mother, but simply to a woman she was glad to know, which was a small thing and also not small at all. At 11 o'clock, the reopening reception was underway in the lobby. Press and stakeholders and the particular choreography of a company demonstrating that it had come through something and was still standing. When Damien found her near the window on the west side, the one that looked toward the park. "How are you doing?" he said. "Ask me something harder," she said. "What are you thinking about?" "Eddie's cart," she said. "The lid on this cup doesn't seal properly. I've been holding it at an angle for 3 years. She paused. "I should tell him." Damien looked at the cup. "Why haven't you?" "I don't know. It stopped seeming like something that needed fixing." She looked at him. "How are you?" "Tired," he said. "In a way that's different from the tired I've been for the last 18 months. He paused. "Better tired. The kind where you can feel what you're tired from." "Yes, exactly that." She looked at the lobby around them. The press, the stakeholders, the company doing its thing, the polished marble and the high windows and the particular machinery of an institution continuing. "Damien," she said. "Yes. I'm not going to be your secretary after today." He was quiet for exactly 1 beat. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying I'm leaving. I'm saying the role needs to change. What I actually do for this company is not what my job title says. And it hasn't been for about 2 years, and we've both been pretending it was because it was convenient. What would you want instead? Something with an actual mandate, she said. Not managing your schedule, managing outcomes. She held his gaze. I'm good at it. You know I'm good at it. I've known that for considerably longer than 2 years, he said. Then we can talk about the structure this week. She picked up her cup, held it at the angle. And someone needs to manage your schedule. It's a real job. It's important. And I've been carrying it in addition to everything else for long enough. I'll have HR post the position. Tell them the coffee order matters, she said. The person needs to understand that the coffee order is not a small thing. He looked at her. Black, he said. No sugar. Always too hot, she said. Always. She looked back at the lobby, at the press moving through it, and the stakeholders and the company, and the renovated marble, and the specific quality of the morning coming through the high windows. She thought about everything it had taken to be standing here. Not the 12 days, further back than that, the 4 years. The careful neutrality and the composed walk, and the 14-hour days, and the arguments she'd been right about, and the ones where she'd been wrong, and the long maintenance of a boundary that had always been slightly more permeable than she'd admitted. She thought about the word written 7 times. She thought about what it had taken to become the solution instead of the variable. Sienna. His voice was quiet. Only for her. She turned. He was looking at her with the undone look, fully present, fully himself, the version she'd asked for on a West Side evening 3 months ago, and that he'd been working to bring, imperfectly and consistently, every day since. I'm glad you stayed, he said. After all of it. I know it wasn't... He paused. It wasn't easy. And you didn't have to. She looked at him. No, she said. I didn't. Why did you? She thought about a lot of answers. She had a lot of them. Practical answers, honest answers, the complicated answers that involved Daniel in the long autumn and the way she'd walked into a conference room on a Tuesday morning ready to be furious and had walked out carrying something heavier and more specific than fury. She thought about all the answers. She gave him the true one. Because you were worth the trouble, she said. And that's not something I say easily. He nodded, once. I know, he said. I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure it stays true. You'd better, she said. The lobby moved around them. The morning continued. The city outside was the city, indifferent, continuous, uninterested in the private settlements of the people living inside its buildings. Somewhere 3 blocks away, Eddie's cart was managing the morning rush, lid not sealing properly on every cup, customers holding them at an angle without knowing why. Sienna Cross stood beside Damian Moretti in a renovated lobby on a Thursday morning, coffee at the correct angle, and she felt, not happiness, which was too simple a word for something this textured, but something in the same country as it. The kind of feeling that comes not from things being easy, but from things being real. From having been tested by something genuine and come out the other side still standing, still herself, with a clear understanding of what herself actually was. She had gone into this as a piece being moved. She had made herself the solution. And now she was standing in the result of that. Not a fairy tale, not a clean ending, but a real one, with work still ahead and 14 conversations still outstanding and a job title that was going to require negotiation and a man beside her who would get things wrong sometimes and tell her about it instead of managing the information, which was the most she'd ever asked of anyone and more than most people had ever managed. The morning came through the windows. The city continued. She drank her coffee at the right angle, held it steady, and let the day begin.